Hello, everybody. Welcome to another in our series of Half Earth Project Educator Ambassador video chats. And as most of you know, some of these chats feature authors. We're trying to sort of explore, I call it exploring biodiversity, a chapter at a time. I'm just so pleased to have Janisse Ray, who's the author of Ecology of a Cracker Childhood. She's agreed to be have a conversation this morning. How are you doing, Janisse?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh yeah, I'm just so pleased that you could find the time to do this. And it's exciting because Ecology of a Cracker Childhood has been reissued in a 20th. I just didn't realize the book was that old. 20th anniversary edition. I think that makes you that qualifies as now a classic. So you have written a classic. The book is a bit of a memoir, and it talks a lot about your up. I mean, there's two really great themes about it. It's about your upbringing in a certain place, and obviously your family and the other characters in your life. But it's also about the longleaf pine ecosystem. So between those two themes, I just really, really like the book. But so maybe we could start off with you just telling me a little bit about, where you grew up and how you grew up. And do I have it right? Baxley, Georgia?
You are perfect. And you see there, US 1 North.
Yeah.
So I grew up about a mile north of Baxley on US 1 North.
Okay.
And the green corridor is the Altamaha River, which is a gorgeous, it's the fourth largest river, that's right, flowing out of the Atlantic seaboard. I'm so glad you figured out. So I was writing a natural history and a personal history, two narratives paired together, kind of trying to show that the trajectory of one is similar to the trajectory of the other. Dennis, I have to tell you, I'm watching wood storks out the window, circling above the pasture.
Well, you're like me. I've got red-shouldered fledglings, red-shouldered hawks, and so I'll do this every once in a while as well, because they'll have a snake or something.
Yeah, wonderful.
I'm sorry, but while you mention that, where are you now? I know you've traveled around a bit, as many of us do in this modern age, but you're back in Georgia now. Where do you live now?
Yes, so if you go north to Lyons and then turn heading toward Savannah, I live in a county just across the Altamaha River. Don't go that far, but I live just across the Altamaha River in a county called Tatnall. And the reason I came back home, okay, so let me go back 1 minute and say this.
Yeah.
I wanted to write about this ecosystem. When I heard about it, it was already 99% gone. Reed Noss had been doing a survey for the National Biological Service, and he found that by 1993, that 99% of natural stands of old growth longleaf had disappeared. So I just thought that nobody would read a book about a pine tree. And I used my childhood as a vehicle to tell what I consider is a much larger story. The interesting thing is that there were publishers who said, if you take out all the natural history, we'll publish this. But it's very important to me that we think about place and how a culture and cultures and peoples spring from the places in which they find themselves. The South is unfortunate in that it was already settled by the time we entered a lot of the land protection movements in this country. So, for example, we have very few national parks in the South. And you can see from the map, the one closest to me is Okefenokee there. Yep. So I wrote another book, which is about this area, the Okefenokee, is actually now joined to Osceola National Forest in Florida. You can't see the national forest on the map that you have on the screen, but in 1988, the first piece between them was purchased by the Nature Conservancy, and now there's a wildlife corridor from the tip of Okefenokee Swamp to the southernmost point of Osceola. We call it O to O, and I wrote a book called Pinhook, Finding Wholeness in a Fragmented Land, which is about this wildlife corridor.
I put in a slide here to kind of represent your childhood, and I like, you already mentioned that by the time you really developed an awareness of the longleaf pine ecosystem, it was, less than 1% of it was extent, and as a child, of course, you didn't really appreciate it. I think you do a really nice job in the book of sort of saying, like, here's my adult perspective, and in getting us to understand why your childhood really mattered and informed all sorts of things you didn't know back then. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, obviously where you grew up, the junkyard did not look like this. It was a active junkyard business, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how you think, what it was like to grow up that way, and how it informed your love of nature.
I did a lot of thinking about that writing the book, because there are similarities. I was thinking that my father's ethos of not throwing away anything was exactly the ethos of Aldo Leopold. If you're gonna tinker, keep all the parts. That was definitely my dad's philosophy. I also saw I think I would have to say that my father was one of the original recyclers. And I learned that, I learned that from him. And I also saw how a culture based on fossil fuels and manufacture and industry was really destroying the natural world. As a child, I saw it as beauty. As an adult, I see it as much more than beauty. I still see beauty as well, and the need for the human psyche. My dog. The need for the human psyche to have beauty. But as a child, I could, I was developing a kind of a puerile aesthetic of the chaos of the place where I lived, as compared to also chaos in the natural forest, but a chaos that made much more sense.
And so when you say you see it, then you really viewed it as beauty. Now you see it so much more. Do you mean things like, do you partly mean our ethical responsibility toward the natural world? Do you partly mean all the utilitarian services we get from nature? Is that what you mean by more?
Well, that was, sorry to interrupt you, Dennis. That was exactly what I was thinking of, all the utilitarian services that we get. Yeah. What was the first thing you said? I want to think about that a little more.
Well, it feels like it relates to Aldo Leopold. It's our own responsibility toward nature, that it probably starts with appreciating beauty, but then feeling like you have a responsibility or a stewardship, over the landscape, and all of the life that it holds.
And I've done a lot of thinking about how to clean up the junkyard. My dad died in December. My mom is still alive. She's 81. And we've started the process of deconstructing it. It's going to be a long process and a very difficult one. So I'm sort of getting to live out those final chapters in Ecology, where I think about what's going to happen one day. Can we ever take it back to the wet pine woods that it was?
So your father was a recycler, very ingenious, mechanical, and it sounds like your grandfather, though, had this knew how to survive out in the woods. He had that sense of place and how nature worked that most of us simply don't grow up with, and that you don't get from academic study of nature. Could you maybe talk about your grandfather a little?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning him. I call him a folk hero in the book. He was orphaned at 13, and he spent a lot of time in the woods. Woods were a safe place for him. So he therefore knew a lot of wood skills that most of us don't have today. He knew how to hunt and fish. He knew how to noodle fish, to just dive under the water and feel around until he came up with 2 catfish, actually, one in each hand. Yep. He remembered where certain things were growing, blooming, fruiting, and he returned to them over and over again. So there were things, now I'm so grateful to live in an era where we are really pushing the limits of exploration of our places. And that sounds like we're heading off into the hinterlands, being imperialists like we were 200 and 300 and 400 years ago. But I don't mean that. I would have never known as a child that edible mushrooms, for example, grow very abundantly in my place. But I have friends. I have one particular friend who grows mushrooms and studies them, and I've walked the woods a lot with him. And now I can go out in the woods and find chanterelles, enough chanterelles to dry and freeze for the entire year. A couple of days ago, I went walking in Moody Forest, which is a very beautiful forest near here. And I was foraging for herbal medicines. Maybe my grandfather would have known 1 or 2 things to use or not use in the forest. Or maybe he had tried a mushroom, but I very much doubt it. So I also see how he knew a lot, and how a lot has been lost from his generation to my generation. And also how my generation and the generations that have followed it have gone even farther.
This was not some small, rare ecosystem in the Southeast United States.
93 million acres of the coastal plains from South Virginia to East Texas, down into Florida. And you can see in Georgia and Alabama, we have a kind of longleaf called montane longleaf, which grows through the Piedmont and up into the mountainous area.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yep.
I didn't actually know about it when I was writing the book. And so if I ever got a chance to rewrite it, I would add a chapter about montane longleaf. I've toured it now and spent some time in it a number of times. But that's a beautiful map. And 93 million acres and 99% of the natural stands gone, but an entirely hopeful ecosystem, because it's just so beloved by people. It's become iconic, and lots of people are engaged in the restoration of it. There's a nationwide initiative to restore it. Millions of acres are being replanted. So a lot of hope for this ecosystem. Wow.
Yeah, I found this one a little, there's a bunch of interesting maps on the project. Some emphasize different things. But this one was interesting because it sort of was prioritizing different areas. And I also I could see that it definitely included your original county of origin. And also, as you know, this is a certain Mr. E.O. Wilson, Dr. E.O. Wilson, this is a beloved ecosystem for him.
Well, this is a good time for me to say what a beloved person he is. I have loved his work since the very beginning. I especially love his work where he talks about himself as a boy growing up in Alabama, and as a person, and I love the more popular scientific work that he does, like Biophilia was a
Yep.
really transformative book for me.
My favorite book of Ed's is Naturalist, which is that's really his memoir. Yep.
I love that book. Just loved it. And I met him a couple of times. Of course, he's done so many lectures around the country and around the world. And I luckily have been in his presence a few times, and just really grateful that there was just this kid who grew up loving snakes and frogs and became this man who cares so deeply about what happens to the natural world. So my gratitude to Dr. Wilson and to you for the work that you do.
Yeah, well, thanks.
So what happened to it is kind of what happens to a lot of ecosystems. And this one, what happened was logging, clear cutting, land settlement for trailer parks, for churches, for homes. It goes on and on and on. And until, you can drive a long way through the South now and not find a natural longleaf pine forest. What you see, the longleaf has mostly been replaced by these things called pine plantations. Mm-hmm. So a pine plantation is an area where the land is denuded and often furrowed, and then pines are planted in rows. They're all one age, one size, one species, and no understory, no forbs and grasses. Mm-hmm. The railroads really didn't punch through to the interior of the South until after the Civil War. Mm-hmm. During the Civil War, you could get from Savannah to Charleston to Richmond, but it was after the Civil War. And it's, this is a conversation that we probably don't want to get into, but there's also the quality here of a people who fought their own country and who were conquered and thus became colonized. So our natural resources were really obliterated. And the beautiful part is that they became things like bridges in New York, and longleaf, that beautiful heart pine, is in many, many, many beautiful structures across the North and across the country and as a whole. So it became beautiful things, but it was the loss of an entire landscape. And I don't know that was really pointed out very well until about the early 1990s, when we were really starting to look at ecosystems on the landscape level, and we just saw, like, my goodness, what Reed Noss called it, a critically endangered ecosystem, like the tallgrass prairie, for example. Dennis, I'd like to talk just a minute about what makes it such a special ecosystem. So it is a monoculture, more or less, of tree. There's usually that one species of pine, Pinus palustris. The understory is the place where the incredible, intense biodiversity occurs. Many, many, many species found in 1 square meter of the understory. It's a tree that's adapted to fire because there are so many lightning strikes traditionally in the South of the United States. A fire would start by lightning in one place and burn very slowly for days and days and days across the landscape. The longleaf pine adapted. It learned to adapt to fire, and it evolved to withstand fire. It did that by first growing as in the grass, in something called the grass stage, which is this little seedling-like thing. It looks like grass.
It stays low early, yeah.
Yeah,
Development.
And so the fire would then creep to that. The needles were very resinous. The fire would jump through it and go on, and then the growth bud, which is in the heart of all these needles, would be protected. And then all the animals associated with it, these many, many animals that you've mentioned, have all adapted to that necessity for fire. Gopher tortoises built these huge burrows, 30 to 60 feet long with multiple entrances. And as they begin to smell the smoke or hear the flames, they're running toward their burrow. About 300 commensals live in the burrows with them.
You said 300 and some commensal species, depending on these burrows that the gopher.
Oh, and I'm reading there at least 360.
Right. Yep.
Other shelter for at least 300. Is that not amazing?
Yeah.
But that could be, it could be a little scarab beetle, anything from something very large down to something very tiny.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and as all the little things that run the world, depending on this, tortoise.
That's beautiful. Thank you for putting that picture up. And
I love your almost like creation story, right? Where the pine and lightning are characters. They're in this battle, and the pine, and that story helped me to appreciate how specialized the pine was for this lightning driven landscape. And it just had never occurred to me that an adaptation would be to be more rapidly combustible, right? So get it over with, have it, the fire moves on, you can survive this short inferno. And then you just beautifully paint how other species join. Once the longleaf pine is showing that you can adapt to lightning, other things come along. But it's sort of it's one of the keystones, obviously, of this whole ecosystem.
That's right. That's so beautifully said.
Yeah. And then, but the reason I put in this creature, who I'd like you to tell us about a little bit here, is because it's one of the first characters of the forest that you really talk about in the book. So maybe tell us a little bit about this creature.
So this is a red-cockaded woodpecker, which is a federally endangered little bird. I wish I were an ornithologist. I'm not. I'm actually not a scientist at all. I call myself a naturalist.
Yeah.
But mainly I'm a writer. I'm just a writer with a mission, which is to bring attention to the natural world and the things we're losing. So as we began to cut longleaf pine forests, this was one of the things that we lost. We lost incredible populations of this little woodpecker. It's now also being restored, usually on...
this is, just to mention, this is data from the Lab of Ornithology. They have these amazing abundance maps that can, they can serve, so it's based on citizen science observations, but you can see where the range of this woodpecker is, really consonant with the range of longleaf pine. Now, this makes it look like it's abundant because these are all the places you might expect to see this bird, but it's in fact, as you point out in the book, nowhere near as abundant as it used to be. But, where there are none of these, I can see lots of woodpeckers here in Maryland, but not a red-cockaded woodpecker.
Because they live in colonies and disperse a certain way, and they need a tremendous amount of acreage to feed a colony. And I'm not smart enough to keep talking about it.
Oh,
really.
But you do a beautiful job of telling the story of this bird in your book. I mean, they're right. So depending on the quality of the woods, they need more acreage. They have this interesting clan, lifestyle. They modify, they don't live in dead snags. They modify living trees, and the sap, is something that they've essentially figured out how to use as a tool. I mean, I think, you know, you tell a really nice story about the natural history of this bird.
And, you know, in thinking about it, that may be also their adaptation to fire, you know,
Yeah.
that could just go into that little cavity when the fire starts coming. I don't know that, but I think that's probably.
I think that's a good hypothesis, because otherwise, yeah, because if your home is in a snag, that snag is going to burn.
Yeah,
they may
that's
be
right.
more rare too.
Yeah, so they will chip out the wood in a tree, and then they're trying to get to a tree with that's heart has been affected by a fungus that makes the heart softer and easier to you know, excavate.
Yeah.
And then after the cavity is chipped out and dug, they will keep pecking at the resin wells around the entrance, so that sap, you can recognize their trees in the woods because they're called candle trees, because you'll see this long sheen of sap down the tree that helps prevent snakes from climbing up and going into the cavity.
One of the iconic species. You tell a great story of finding one of these with a friend of yours. Tell us a little bit about the indigo snake.
So the indigo snake is a very special snake, and I hope you love snakes. This snake is fairly benign. It grows up to about 8 feet in length. It's a dark, iridescent, you see the colors there, just this iridescent black, just this gorgeous jewel of a snake. But it is a non-venomous snake, incredibly beautiful. It grows long, you know, 8 feet, maybe a little more. It will also use gopher tortoise burrows. It is in Georgia a species of special concern. I think it's on the federal threatened list, but it was used in circuses in the past. It was a snake that, you know, probably wouldn't bite you if you wrapped it around your neck and
Right.
pulled people.
In so-called hoochie coochie shows, and
that's right.
Like,
that's right.
Because it's just such a friendly snake, but big, so you can drape it, and
That's right.
that's really,
and so rarely seen these days.
Yeah.
I've only seen 1 or 2, maybe 3 in my, maybe a few more, maybe a handful of snakes in the wild in my lifetime, but not for years and years and years.
Wow. Well,
And I live in a place, Dennis, where I see lots of snakes. I mean, we have chickens, and we're just relocating red rat snakes and yellow rat snakes all the time.
Wow.
We take them across the river, and then they swim across and come back.
They swim right back.
Last week, I photographed a red-bellied water snake, which had come from a marsh about a quarter of a mile away and was just in the yard. I mean, snakes, as you know from Dr. Wilson, like the South is the place for snakes.
Right.
And this snake, unfortunately, is one you probably will never see. Yeah. So I think over time we will be hearing more good news. So maybe in my lifetime and in your lifetime, we will get to see another one of these in the wild.
I hope so. I'm gonna make that a little goal. Now, we already talked about the gopher tortoise, but I think you just mentioned that the indigo snake is dependent on gopher tortoise burrows. Is that right? Yeah. So
that's right. It's one of those commensals. It's one of those 360 commensals.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just a really important point about the interconnectedness of things. And then you mentioned other so many interesting creatures in the book, but I thought I'd throw in Bachmann Sparrow, because again, you can see the abundance map shows the range exactly matches. This is a creature that is, really endemic to this ecosystem, non-migratory, and you do a really interesting thing in the book because you pen a letter as if John James Audubon was writing a letter to his friend, the Reverend Bachmann, who he named this sparrow after. And I like that. And it reminded me a little of, I don't know if you're a fan of Lincoln in the Bardo, but it reminded me a little bit of that. I wonder if you were an inspiration to that writer.
I remember doing that. It was that, so at that point, the editor, the publisher had taken this book, the book was in manuscript form. So that was one of the later chapters that I wrote.
Yep.
And she had taken it on vacation with her and came back and she said, you should start when you're born and end when you leave Georgia, and you should alternate the chapters between these two histories, your personal and the natural. And so in putting the chapters together, I realized, like, I've got a blank here. So I could choose some other species to write about. And it's, you know, as a writer who's trying to be creative and trying to listen to other voices, I just hit upon this idea of a letter.
What does it mean to be a cracker? And I'll just throw out a few things that were, you know, my upbringing was very different. You mentioned, I think you say you never went to a movie theater. You went to you had one restaurant dinner. Could, you know, maybe talk about that a little bit?
So when I think about my childhood, there are these, you know, arms of it, and one is poverty. That raised on this junkyard. I was raised on a junkyard because my dad was poor and making, you know, good use of what was around him to try to turn into wealth, or in this case, just into money. Another part of it, of course, was religion. You know, how faith-based my upbringing was. My dad suffered from a kind of mental illness called manic depressive that most people would know about, bipolar. And that's another arm of childhood. So when I was a child, my father's religion forbade us to have a television in the house, for example. He was very, very strict. And because of that, my family, we were all able to go to the library and check out stacks of books. There was some censure of the books, but not that much. You could really, you know, sneak in stacks of whatever you wanted to read.
Right.
And so because books were these doorways for me, these portals, I've always said that they saved my life. And I don't mean literally, I just mean they opened this kid who was raised in this very isolated, poor, you know, fundamentalist junkyard, and opened me to the possibilities of what life could be for a person. I was pretty young when I read Marjorie Canaan Rawlings' The Yearling.
The Yearling, yeah.
A gorgeous book. And I went on to read her, a later book of hers, a book called Cross Creek. And, you know, without knowing it, I had this model. This person was writing about animals. You know, you could read Tess of the Dubervilles all day and never, or you could read anybody, Willa Cather or Thoreau, and never read about this little green lizard that turns brown when he's on the trunk of a tree and turns green when she's on leaves of the tree. So Marjorie Rawlings was writing about my place. And suddenly this place, you know, the South, unfortunately, if you're raised in the South, the South brings along with it a good deal of baggage, you know, a good deal of shame and lots of others, you know, lots of other things. But there was a place in reading a book like Rawlings' Cross Creek where I could see that somebody had found value in this landscape that I lived this place that I knew. And that changed me permanently. Stories are a beautiful way to bring about transformation, including transformation in the way we live on the earth, that hopefully, please let it be so that we can find ways of living that don't destroy us and our environments and all the things we love, all the other creatures. So that's why right now, some people might say, well, you're not really a creative writer because you have this mission always, you're always trying to change people. You're didactic, you're a preacher. And I am, but I also hope that I can tap somewhere deep, deep into my psyche that then resonates with yours and with your soul. And I can show you, what incredible joy is to be had in direct relationship with the earth and the processes of the earth, the cycles of seasons and tides and weather and moons and on and on.
You say you went off to college not knowing the name of a single wild bird except maybe the crow, but you credit this teacher. I think it was a elementary school science teacher. Tell us a little bit about Lucia Godfrey.
So Lucia Godfrey taught middle school, what we called junior high.
Middle school, okay, yep.
And one day I had tried to play football with the boys in my class, but they didn't want this girl wearing a dress to play football. So I went and joined Ms. Godfrey where she was standing looking off at a pine tree blooming. And so she began to tell me about pine trees, the natural history of pine trees, that there are male pine trees and there are female pine trees, and how you would tell the two apart and what a cone means. And I found that fascinating. Her class was always like that. It was a class that touched something inside me. So way down in the junkyard was a clump of pitcher plants, this carnivorous plant, Sarracenia flava. This one was, I think, flava. And I remember bringing one to school to her. She was the kind of teacher who had microscopes set up and we could look at ditch water and study rocks and learn the names of things. So you're right. I do say I left home not, completely ignorant, never having known a naturalist, but I would say this science teacher came pretty close to lighting a fire inside me. Yeah. And that's what all teachers can do. With the home life that I had extremely loving parents. I had enough to eat. I always had clothing and shoes, and I had books, but where would I be without these teachers who told me things that nobody else in my life was telling me? Yeah. I mean, so many of us are so indebted to all of our teachers, past, present, and future, really. Yeah. And so then this is a great time to say thanks for the teachers who devote their entire lives to bringing light to children, to adults, enlightenment. They're just shining these lights that sometimes don't get shown otherwise. And bless them.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like when I think back, I wish I had said a little more appreciative things of some of my teachers over the years. They don't realize, some of them don't realize the impact they have and how appreciated they are. So I hope Ms. Godfrey got to read that chapter, but
she did.
Yeah.
She did.
Excellent.
Yep.
So good.
And in fact, a lot of my teachers, since I moved back to the same area, I still see a lot of the teachers I had. So I've been able to express gratitude a lot to the people who lifted me out of a childhood that was often inexplicable. And Yeah. And so to teachers who are listening, then, you know, I think teachers know better than the rest of us the power that they have to transform a life, to bring a story alive, even a story for a child who's mute and whose story hasn't been told. It's an amazing, amazing gift that they've been given to shepherd children into enlightenment.
Well, I think I can't think of a better way to close. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your book and your life and the Longleaf. Thank you so much. And
well, thank you so much, you and the entire foundation, and Dr. Wilson. Seriously, thank you for caring about life on Earth, you know, for seeing what we're doing to it and wanting to change the course of that trajectory. And thank you for being interested in this ecosystem that's far away from you and quite diminished, but very hopeful and coming back every day, coming back.
Yeah. Janisse, thanks so much for agreeing to read a couple passages. I think it'll be great to, by the way, I've listened to your book on audiobook. You do a great job reading it. So here's a little sample. So please share a passage or two with us.
What thrills me most about Longleaf Forest is how the pine trees sing. The horizontal limbs of flattened crowns hold the wind as if they're vessels, sinking bowls, and air stirs in them like a whistling kettle. I lie in thick grasses covered with sun and listen to the music made there. This music cannot be heard anywhere else on the earth. Rustle, whisper, whinny, aria, chorus, ballad, lullaby. In the choirs of the original groves, the music must have resounded for hundreds of miles in a single note of rise and fall, lift and wane, and stirred the red-cockaded woodpeckers, nesting in the hearts of these pines, where I also nest. Now we strain to hear the music. Anachronous, it has an edge. It falters, a great tongue chopped in pieces. Something happens to you in an old growth forest. At first, you're curious to see the tremendous girth and height of the trees, and you sally forth eager. You start to saunter, then amble, slower and slower, first like a fox, and then an armadillo, and then a tortoise, until you're trudging at the pace of an earthworm, and then even slower, the pace of a sassafras leaf's turning. The blood begins to languish in your veins until you think it's turned to sap. You look up at leaves so high, their shapes are beyond focus, into far branches with circumferences as thick as most trees. I'm skipping a little. Every limb of your body becomes weighted. There's this strange current of energy running skyward, like 1,000 tiny bells tied to your capillaries. If you stay in one place too long, you know you'll root. I drink old growth forest like water. This is the homeland that built us. Here I walk shoulder to shoulder with history, my history. I'm in the presence of something ancient and venerable. I can see my place as human, in a natural order more grand, whole, and functional than I've ever witnessed, and I'm humbled, not frightened by it, comforted. It's as if a round table springs up in the cathedral of pines, and God graciously pulls out a chair for me, and I no longer have to worry about what happens to souls. Thank you. I was visiting a school in Thomasville, Georgia, and one of the students, I hung it up on the shoji screen for this. One of the students had painted this for me, and I brought another one. I didn't have time to hang them both up, but this is crayon, you know, it's wax, and another student did that. It's just amazing. I get to go, you know, it's what a lovely life. You get to go talk to kids, and they get to give you presents like that painting.